Last year in Justice League Dark, Ram V had Swamp Thing sacrifice his body in order to defeat the Upside Down Man and save his friends on the Justice League team. Swamp Thing had previously been reunited with the soul of Alec Holland, meaning that for the first time in years, he was finally Alec Holland returned in the body of Swamp Thing. But now, the body was destroyed, and the future of Swamp Thing seemed uncertain. The Future State version of Swamp Thing, of course, was one of the best series to come out of the whole Future State debacle. And I enjoyed it so much that I decided to give the new Swamp Thing series a chance. Swamp Thing number 3 continues to impress me with how good the story actually is. Ram V, who wrote Justice League Dark and the Future State series, is writing this current Swamp Thing series, and I must say, this is very enjoyable. This particular issue continues the story of our new hero, Levi Kamei, whose name I've probably butchered, who has found himself infused with the power of the green and has become the new Swamp Thing. Unlike Alec Holland's transformation, which was originally as a swamp creature who simply added the consciousness of Alec Holland to its own plant body, only later to be fused with the actual mind of Alec Holland, Levi is a man who's finding himself constantly being metamorphosized into the Swamp Thing creature. The comic has become a full body horror type of title, where the nightmare scenarios are taking over his mind. He's finding himself sleepwalking as this creature. He's never quite sure if he's dreaming or alive as his body distorts and transforms into this quote-unquote monster. And he knows that there are other beings out there who wish to destroy the Swamp Thing. And he knows that there are other beings out there who wish to guide him and help protect him. And he doesn't understand any of it. It's a great series. It really brings a lot of psychological horror and drama to a character that's traditionally been a lot of fun horror, but not really a lot of scares. It was definitely scary and horrific back in the late 70s and early 80s, but once we got into the 90s and 2000s, the book tried way too hard to be a superhero book with some horror elements shoehorned in from time to time. Ram V plays Swamp Thing as a straight-up horror story. This works just as well as John Carpenter's The Thing as it does The Swamp Thing. I love this story. It's unfortunately listed as only being a 10-issue miniseries, and maybe that's just to test out the waters in the new Infinite Frontier, but I'm hoping this sells well enough that it'll be around for a long time. One other thing that's worth mentioning with this particular issue is that he brings in Poison Ivy, whose plant powers are a good foil to bounce off of Swamp Thing. But he's not afraid to make Poison Ivy the clear villain in this particular instance. A lot of people in the last few years have tried to play Poison Ivy off as a misguided hero, or perhaps someone who's been misunderstood because of the way that she wants to protect nature. But here, Ram V has split Ivy into two personalities, regular Ivy and Poison Ivy, to clearly show that Poison Ivy is the villain through and through. She's heartless and cruel and mean. And Ivy, without Poison Ivy, is a mere shell of a personality. She can barely string together a coherent sentence, much less be a full personality. So it shows that Poison Ivy on the whole is not a good person. And for all of the fan fiction and all of the shipping that's been done over the past few years with Poison Ivy and Harley Quinn, it's nice to see someone stand up to the actual true nature of Poison Ivy and show her as the true villain that she actually is. The art by Mike Perkins uses a lot of photographic references, and this helps it to get a very realistic look. And I think the realism is one of the reasons why the book works so well. Instead of everything being overly fantastic or maybe even highly stylized, there's a very real grounding that the artwork has. And that realism adds a lot of the feeling that you have that this could actually be happening even though it's very fantastic. The way you see good special effects in a movie. When special effects are very well done, you don't even notice them, even though they can be exceptional. Take the first time you saw Star Wars, for instance. Obviously, you knew that lightsabers weren't real and that spaceships weren't really zipping around shooting laser beams in space, but it looked real, and so your mind just bought into it. The same goes with the artwork in this book. Yes, I'm comparing the artwork of Swamp Thing to the special effects of Star Wars. But it holds because the realism of the artwork is part of what adds to the overall horror and the mood and the tension and that feeling you have that this is something that's actually happening. And there's a lot of texture, there's a lot of grit, there's a lot of emotion, a lot of depth. And the colors from Mike Spicer are often presented very flat and dulled, which you would feel might draw you away from the artwork. But instead, I think it helps to add to that realism. Because nothing looks fantastic in the sense that, again, you lose that realism. Everything with that dull and flat look helps to add to that sense of the darkness, the grimness, the heaviness, the dirtiness, and again, that realism that adds to the overall feel of the book. As you flip through the pages, you can't help but notice how just solid everything looks. Unlike a lot of other artwork out there that when they show these fantastic forms, shows a lot of giant space. There are times in this book where you see fantastical creatures that are, who knows, 600 yards high, 800 yards high, walking through these giant jungle landscapes. It doesn't break down, and you get a real sense of depth because of the way the coloring, the shading, the texturing is done, because there's this added sense of grit and depth and shadow, and there's a haziness that's added to it. And it all, again, makes the artwork work. Because instead of being fantastic, it looks dirty and grimy and dusty and maybe over-pollinated, and just adds to that feel of being real. Swamp Thing 3 retails for $3.99 and has 22 pages of story. And while I wish it had more, the 22 pages that we have never feels like it cheaps out too much. Now, I will say that there are several pages that are full-page panels of artwork or two-page spreads that perhaps could have been condensed down a little bit more in order to put more story into the issue. But the amount of story that we have doesn't feel like too little for the amount of money that we paid. I feel like this was a good issue, with plenty happening and lots of character development and story progression. And I always want more. I'm always happy to get lots of things happening in a comic. But these 22 pages didn't feel like it ever skimped a whole lot on the story. Even though there were moments I wished things could have been condensed a little bit more, instead of focusing so much on having giant panels of artwork. My overall enjoyment of the story and my love of the artwork allows me to overlook a little bit some of my misgivings about the lack of density of the story. Even though it's a $4 comic with 22 pages of story, and I might quibble a little bit with some of the giant panels of artwork and 2-page spreads, I'm more than happy to pay the price I paid to get the story I got. I don't feel cheated at all by some of the giant panels of artwork because I love this story.